MindCORE who is speaking today, Diego Reinero. Diego did his PhD at New York University and spent 2 years as a presidential postdoctoral fellow at Princeton before joining us here at Penn. Diego, as a grad student, did some of the earliest work on brain synchronicity and the performance of teams. And he is now doing some very interesting work on how people's moral and political views change based on who they talk to, who they're in conversation with, what those social networks that structure who we talk to are. And he's going to tell us a little bit about it. His talk is titled Malleable Moral Minds. So let's welcome Diego.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for all being here. And we go to, is it 1:15 that we're supposed to go till? Okay, I'll try and keep an eye on that. Great, yeah, if you have to head out, no problem. Okay. So one thing that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is this kind of big question about what makes us polarized and divided, and when do we find common ground on moral or political issues, right? I think we can think of a lot of real-world examples around intergroup conflict and rising polarization in our country and all around the world. But other times when we are able to sort of shift our views, come to some sort of consensus and compromise. I think this question of do we ever change our moral political minds is pressing, in part because I think there's sort of a paradox that I hope that my research is starting to resolve, right? And that is that in the literature, there's one kind of dominant view, which is that when people moralize something or their political views are very entrenched, right? They have these views on issues and we're completely stubborn to change, right? But on the other hand, we see at kind of societal collective levels, we do see change, right? It almost seems obvious that, well, if you just take the gay rights movement, for example, just 25 years ago, like 25% of Americans supported gays' right to marry, and now it's around like 75%, right? And that's just one example, but others abound, right? Gender equality, both in the workplace and in politics, legalization of marijuana, right? So it's clear that people's views are shifting on these. But what's not clear is like how and how that's actually happening. And one dominant view in political science suggests that this sort of broader societal change is happening through cohort or generational replacement. In other words, moral progress is happening one funeral at a time. People are essentially dying and taking their ideas with them, and new ideas are kind of coming into the world through new people. I think that's part of the story, but I don't think that's the full story. And so my research aim is to start to unpack how can we understand these kind of subtle, small shifts that people have in their moral and political views on important issues as they work in the social world around them and they interact with other people in conversations and in social networks. So as a social psychologist, in particular, I consider how our social identities. Turn your video. Hi, people on Zoom. I'm a real person. In particular, I consider how our social identities and like our political identities and social influence, like through conversations and social norms, impact and shape our ability to reach a shared reality with other people. And again, in particular, I focus on how these factors play a role in shifting our moral and our political views. And as you'll see in a lot of my work, I try and ground my research in sort of ecologically valid designs to capture the richness of the real world while trying to maintain experimental control as much as possible. Okay, so today I want to share 3 different projects that I think touch on this theme of how people's moral and political views shift in different domains and different settings. So first, I'll talk a little bit about shifting political views through fact checks and looking at the risks of political misinformation. Then I'll shift and talk about everyday moral judgments and conversations with people and how we make sense of the world together and decide what's right and what's wrong. And then if there's enough time, I'll hopefully be able to talk a little bit about a project looking at shifting people's views about climate change in group conversations. Okay. So as is no surprise to anyone, the rise of social media has been really prolific in the past 20 years since its advent, really. Now more than 5 billion people use social media, which is like pretty incredible, right? This is like 60, 70% of the world. And 80% of Americans get their news on social media. So what this means is that social media is a really, really big platform, right? For people to have online conversations about all sorts of things. And it's not just everyday people who are having these conversations, right? Politicians have been, especially of late, getting more active And they're been getting more engagement when they share on social media, right? But of course, along with the rise of social media, this really, really big platform and kind of online conversation space, there's also been the rise of misinformation, right? And that was true both in the 2016 election and Russia's interference and the results of different elections and the COVID-19 pandemic. There's all sorts of examples abound of the proliferation of fake news. And the problem with misinformation and fake news too is that it's pretty pernicious, right? It may be overall less likely than true news in the world, but it's sticky, it's easy to remember, and it's likely to be more fake news is 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories. So it can be hard when we're trying to fight misinformation and build a shared reality around important political issues when we have a really, really big platform like social media, and we have politicians and elites who may be sharing misinformation that can easily spread through networks. And of course, engaging with misinformation is bad. I don't think I have to convince anyone of that, but it's been empirically demonstrated to be associated with things like COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy, skepticism about climate change, even reduced voter turnout. So this is bad, and we should do something about it, right? But what do we do about political misinformation? Well, if you're thinking about this, you might be like, well, I don't know. Why don't we just tell people it's wrong, right? Obviously, that's how we solve this. We just say, this is not true, end of story, right? Now I see some little like smiles and laughs because it seems so silly, like obviously we do it. But in fact, this is in fact what we mostly do. Just a few weeks ago on my Instagram feed, I saw the New York Times post around the Israel-Hamas war, a number of disinformation and false claims that have been circulating in recent weeks. And essentially, they do that, right? They post the misinformation claim, and then they're like, look, this is not true. These are the facts. And so this is kind of mostly what we do to try and correct political misinformation. The good news is that these kinds of corrections have been shown to reduce belief. Debunking or labeling information as untrue does seem to work a little bit. There's ideas about when it's best to do that, possibly immediately after someone sees a correction, although that's not always possible. And also sometimes in giving a correction, you can reiterate the misinformation, which can cause problems for what people later on remember. There's also an implied truth for things that are not yet labeled as false. So if we're living in a world where we expect things to be marked as true or false, if you see something that isn't marked as false, you might just imply like, well, it's probably true then, because it's not explicitly listed as false. There's also a chance, of course, of corrections backfiring, though those seem rare in aggregate, right? When backfiring, the idea there is like people double down on the misinformation. They see correction and they're like, not only don't think that's true, but now I'm going to believe the misinformation even more than I did had you not corrected me. So it's like literally the opposite of what you have hoped to have happened. We also know from the literature that fact checking is less effective for political misinformation. People have these like strong values and identities, and when you start to correct people on some of that information, that can be less effective. And some people will argue that, well, the thing we should do to fix this problem is to just get everyone to care about being accurate. If you care about being accurate, then you have better truth discernment of what's true and what's false. That's great in a vacuum, but the problem with that is that we have a lot of other motives going into how we interact, for example, on social media, right? So we don't all just care about being accurate. We care about our reputations. We care about our influence, right? And all of those things can sometimes be competing when we're in these online ecosystems. And I think one thing missing from this whole conversation is the role of partisan identity salience in the efficacy of these corrections, right? So it's when we see these kind of online dialogues and tit for tat and conversations that happen between politicians, between people from different political camps, it's really clear that who the source is matters, right? Who is the message coming from, and who do they belong to? Are they part of my in-group? Are they part of my out-group? How does that affect my willingness to believe what they're saying versus whether it's misinformation or a correction? And so in this work, we asked this question: does fact-checking political misinformation work? Does it not really do anything, or does it even backfire? And under what circumstances? And how much of it all does the partisan identity of the source matter? Okay, so we ran 3 experiments. The good news is that they all follow the same methodological structure. So I'm just going to describe the trial structure here once. That'll give you the gist, and then I'll present all the results. So essentially, participants saw a misinformation tweet, and they would rate their belief in that tweet, their certainty of their belief, and their willingness to share that tweet. And then they saw a correction tweet, and then they saw a misinformation tweet, that same misinformation tweet and correction tweet side by side, and asked to re-rate their belief in that initial misinformation and their certainty and willingness to share, right? So this is kind of the general structure. There's a number of things I want to mention about this structure, though. One is that we source misinformation from things that actual politicians had said, and we source corrections from PolitiFact, which is a fact-checking news organization. Actually, is PolitiFact in APPC? No, that's different. Okay. So these are kind of very ecologically valid, and these are things that politicians had actually shared, and corrections that actually would have existed. But we crafted the language so that any given tweet could be ostensibly said by any politician from a given political camp, right? So a misinformation tweet about immigration, we would essentially have it come from randomly sample from a pool of like 5 politicians that were from, let's say, like the Republican side, or a tweet about or about the healthcare act or something might be randomly sampled to come from any one of a number of Democrats, right? So it's always ideologically congruent and aligned. It would make sense that that politician would be saying something along those lines. But it wasn't necessarily like that specific politician who had said that specific thing. And we were doing that so that we could generalize or have better generalizability in our results, that it wasn't just this specific person on this specific message. It was, this is a broader effect that we can, because we're randomly sampling from different politicians. And we had a number of different political topics as well that were part of this. Also, as you'll notice from this design, it's not like a professional fact check, like the way you might see from like Twitter labeling things as false or true. This is more like kind of a more conversational, real world dynamic where people are sharing things and then rebutting things, right? Which I think mimics probably a lot more of what we see in kind of our online sphere. Another thing to mention is that the original tweet always did have some element of misinformation. The correction tweet always was bringing people more in line with truth, although they weren't always necessarily knowing that. And the last thing I want to mention is that in our first experiment, participants did 10 trials, and in experiments 2 and 3, they did 18 trials. So it wasn't just like a one-off, they were doing a number of these trials. Okay, I think that's all I need to convey. And then I just wanted to highlight the main differences between these experiments are the sources that we use. So in experiment 1, we used famous politicians. I'm sure you recognize probably all of the Democrats and Republicans on screen. In experiment 2, we shifted, we used less famous politicians. I would imagine that you don't recognize any of the Democrats and Republicans on screen. Our participants didn't recognize them. We also included a number of neutral organizations that have been pilot tested to be seen as trustworthy and not partisan by both Democrats and Republicans. And in experiment 3, we used sort of lay people. We made up Twitter handles that reflected being from the left or the right or neutral. And so what we have here are different types of sources across our experiments. Some where you're like supercharged partisan identity, like in experiment 1, these people have, come with a lot of baggage and you might know a lot about them. Experiment 2, they're from different camps, they're political elites, but you don't actually really know much about these politicians. And in experiment 3, these are just sort of probably, as you might see, just kind of randos on Twitter. Okay. So first we can ask, do fact checks work or backfire? Now I'm going to show you 3 graphs side by side here. The good news is that they're all going to kind of look the same. So I just want to walk us through how one of them looks. So on the y-axis here, you're seeing people's belief. On the x-axis, you're seeing before and after, so before and after the correction. And split into 2 panels here is whether the misinformation is coming from an in-group member or an out-group member. So what we see are two things that jump out right away. First is that you see this really, really large in-group bias, right? People believe misinformation from their in-group a lot more than they do from their out-group, right? And that's to be probably expected, but the degree to which that bias is there, I think, is notable. And the other thing you see is that our corrections did seem to be working a little bit, right? Pretty small effects. The fact that the slopes are slanted downward suggests that people are decreasing their belief in the misinformation after the correction, right? So that's sort of good news, right? But again, that size of that, the efficacy of that effect is really swamped by this in-group bias. That's like a 12 times difference in the size of those 2 effects. We replicate these. Well, that's a little hard to see. We replicate these results in experiments 2. You can see the lines. But what importantly, the steepness of those lines has increased, right? So the fact check is a little better. It's a little more efficacious. And the in-group bias, the difference between people's belief in their in-group and their out-group, is a little bit smaller, right? So that's only a 3x difference. And then again, we replicate that in study 3 as well. Okay, so we're replicating our results across a number of different sources. And the things to notice are that in experiments 2 and 3, when we use less salient politicians or lay people, and those partisan identities are a bit less salient, the efficacy of people's corrections is increasing and their in-group partisan bias is decreasing. So it sort of seems like if we want to let people sort of be a little bit more open-minded to corrections and less sort of at the whims of these partisan biases, maybe tamping down how salient some of these partisan identities is an important feature of it. Okay. Of course, we can aggregate all 3 studies together and kind of find an overall result. Looks like that. So on aggregate, it sort of seems like fact checks are working, right? Like if you look back here, like it's like everything's going down. That's good. Seems like fact checks are are sort of small decreases in people's belief in that misinformation. That's great. But if you break out on a trial by trial basis, what's happening, it's like, sure, the grand majority of the time, people are updating their belief in light of the correction. So they're, not believing the misinformation quite as much, but also a non-trivial amount of time they're backfiring, right? They're actually doubling down and believing the misinformation even more. So again, those aggregate results don't really convey that. And I think this is important. I want to harp on it in part because I think the literature around political misinformation and fact checks is focused on too much on do things work or not, and not when and for whom do these things work well or backfire. So what we can do is we can actually model this on a trial by trial basis and look at some risk factors associated with those backfires, right? So we can basically treat trials as like zeros and ones and say like this was a backfire trial versus not, and we can look at a number of different predictors that might predict someone backfiring on that. And what we see is that when an outgroup member replies, they're 93% more likely to backfire. This replicates in experiment 2 at 40% and experiment 3 at 30%, right? So our results are, again, replicating across all the experiments. The pattern of results is very similar. And if you aggregate this data together, the average is that political accurate fact checks are 52% more likely to backfire, right? And again, I think this starts to give us a better understanding of what are some of the risk factors for this, right? And what can we be aware of and cognizant of when we go into trying to understand how people process political misinformation and update their beliefs in light of corrections. I also think this points to kind of a broader trend that our hate towards the out party is really growing. So this is a graph that basically shows you how warm people feel towards their in-group or their out-group. And you can see that the top line, over the past 40 years, people have sort of stayed similar in how warm they feel towards their in-group. But they've been really steadily decreasing over the past 40 years and how much they like their out-group, right? So there's more out-group hate, and that's part of what's driving this polarization. I think the results in our experiments here touched on that because you can see how sensitive people are to out-group corrections, right? They're really disbelieving of out-groups, and they're very sensitive to even backfiring when out-groups issue corrections. Okay, at the end of the experiment, we also asked participants a question about what surprised them to get at some open-ended responses. I just thought for fun, I would show you a couple. Here's a Democrat from Florida who says, it was interesting to me that sometimes seeing rebuttals of Democratic tweets by Republicans gave me slight pause, and sometimes it made me more sure of the original tweet's veracity. This is literally describing himself backfiring or herself backfiring. Okay. More often than not, though, we saw a response like this from this Republican from Virginia who said, I was slightly surprised that my opinion could change even when it was answered by a political foe. Right. And then some people said, no, Sarah Palin still annoys me. Like this Democrat from New York's not a surprise that they would say that. Okay, so in sum, we see that while in-group bias in belief is present, especially it's true for Democrats. I didn't have time to show you that, but that's especially true. People nevertheless update their views after correction, and more so when partisan identities are less salient. Out-group replies are the biggest risk factor for backfiring, and in-group members are sort of a risk and a remedy. On one hand, we're really easy to accept information that comes from our in-group, even if it's not true. On the other hand, I didn't have time to show this either, but corrections that come from in-group members work better than they do from out-group members, sort of the flip side of out-group members being likely to cause us to backfire. But in-group corrections, we update more to those. So it's sort of trying to find a balance between the fact that you want to find someone who doesn't piss off the other side too much, but you're also going to be credible and a trusting source that you'll actually update your views. And so maybe someone like, a more local politician who's part of your camp, but they don't come with the baggage that some of these like national famous politicians come with, might be better messengers for, helping moderate some of these conversations around what's true and what's not. Okay. So now I want to shift from political views in fact checking to everyday moral judgments in dyadic conversations. So again, in everyday life, I think we collectively decide what's true or false, as we were just talking about. Or what's right and what's wrong. I think this is true whether it's kind of formalized in the courts, like in juries, where literally it's a collective of people deciding what's right and what's wrong and whether this person deserves to be punished or not. But also just kind of in more everyday life when we're with friends and family or around strangers and we're trying to ascertain whether what someone did was okay or not, or even just around the dining table with family and friends. And so I think how people make decisions or judgments about what's okay and what's not, what's right and what's wrong, is very social. And yet there's been a really heavy emphasis on the individual in moral psychology. So there's this nice review paper that looks at kind of the past 80 years of moral psychology. And they have a number of different findings. They actually don't emphasize this one as much. But if you look at this graph, you can tease out that there's 3 times more studies, research that's been done at the individual level compared to the interpersonal group level, right? So there's a really have an emphasis on how people make moral judgments on their own, when in fact, I think often we are very, very influenced by how other people around us, in terms of the decisions and judgments that we make. And not only that, but there's a real difference between kind of the real world judgments that we make versus the way it's often been studied through like hypothetical stick figure trolley problems. Like, show of hands, who here recognizes this trolley problem type thing? Okay, basically everybody. Show of hands, who here has pushed a large man over a bridge to stop a train? All right, we should talk later. But I think, right, the point is like, this is not really our everyday experience. Our everyday experience is like, should I go home? Should I travel for COVID? Is it okay to go out to a restaurant? You know, these are kind of the everyday experiences that we have, that we navigate in everyday life, our obligations to other people. And so I think morality is very, very social. And there's been an underappreciation for this degree of social influence in how we make judgments and decisions, in terms of what we just deem right and wrong. So we can ask here in this next research question, we ask, how do conversations about everyday morally ambiguous events influence moral judgments, and how do people reach moral consensus more broadly? And when I talk about kind of more ambiguous events, I mean, imagine a scenario here that we showed participants later of a guy who stockpiled 18,000 bottles of hand sanitizer during the pandemic. He was going to price gouge and like sell them for a marked up price. He was later found out, so he ended up donating them all to a charity. And so we can ask, should the man still be penalized for attempting to profit off of hand sanitizer during a pandemic, despite having donated all to a charity now? People have different views on this, or the degree to which he should or shouldn't, or it's like, I don't know, it's a wash. He ended up doing something nice with it. He's a reformed person. Or this other news video of a ER doctor who got fired because he refused to get vaccinated for COVID-19. And if you watch the clip, he's like kind of a reasonable guy. He's like talking about like how, of course, he's like a medical professional. He's informed. He just takes all these precautions, but he just didn't feel comfortable with like kind of the long-term unknowns about the COVID-19 vaccine. And so we can ask, how deserving is this doctor being fired for refusing to get vaccinated against COVID-19, right? And so this is kind of, we see it in the news. We talk about it in gossip with friends. All sorts of different examples about things that there's not very clear-cut consensus on, and we're trying to figure out what's true and what's not, or what's okay and what's not, by talking about it with other people. So these are the kinds of examples and scenarios. And so when we studied this, what we did is we brought in strangers to have conversations over Zoom. And what they did is, I'll walk us through a trial, is they essentially would see a scenario, a headline, a video clip from the real world, like kind of like I just showed you. And then they would make a time one set of ratings, indicating what their judgment was of that scenario, how certain they were, how much they moralized it, how much it was tied to the notions of right and wrong. So they're making these kind of private ratings at the outset of like, I've seen this thing. Do I think that doctor deserved to be fired? Do I think that guy deserved to be penalized for stockpiling hand sanitizer? So they make these private judgments at time one. And then they have a conversation. We just say, just talk about it, express your views, exchange opinions for a few minutes. And so they talk to the stranger for a few minutes. And at the end of the conversation, we ask them to make a mutual judgment, where they have a shared slider that they can both move around and updates on real time for both people on their screens. And we say, you know, see if you can make a judgment that sort of reflects both of your opinions. So they make this mutual judgment. We also then ask them to indicate how much shared reality they felt with their partner, like privately afterward. And then after the conversation, we have a time two set of ratings. So essentially we have this like pre and post conversation judgments from people, right? Before and after the conversation, what did they think of the scenario? Then we actually give people a second look at the scenario, say, well, maybe the conversation changed your mind, or maybe you missed something the first time, or it reframed the way you were looking at it. So you get a second chance to look back at it. And then we get a time three set of ratings that are, again, identical. So this is kind of how a trial structure looked. And then people did this like on 9 different trials with different scenarios or examples or headlines on each of them. But they were always talking to the same partner for each of these scenarios. Okay. So first we can look at, do people's moral judgments or views change at all, right? And so we can look at the absolute difference between their pre-conversation judgment and their post-conversation judgment, and on the x-axis here. And what we see is that, yes, people's moral judgments did shift significantly from time 1 to time 2. People actually had a change of heart 12% of the time, where they were on one side of the scale beforehand. Like, no, I think he's totally wrong or he should have completely been fired. And then they flip over to the other side. Actually, I don't think he should have been fired. And they shifted substantially, which I'm sort of arbitrarily calling 25 points or more here, 13% of the time. Now, these percentages aren't huge, but I think they're substantive, right? And the fact that a short few minute conversation with a stranger about this issue is shifting your views around. Sometimes it's shifting it quite a bit. I think this has implications for how malleable our judgments can be about these kinds of issues. Of course, this just describes like, did people change and move around at all? But we might wonder, well, like, well, how did they change? Did their judgments or views align? Did they polarize? Like, what ended up happening? One way to look at that is to look at the correlation over time between the dyad's judgments. So here on the x-axis, I have person A's judgment, and on the y-axis, I have person B's judgment. And we can see that at time one, before the conversation, the association between their judgments is fairly small, right? It's a slightly positively correlated, but it's really not a lot going on, right? Basically, people come in, they have sort of different views and takes on the scenario at the outset. And then when we look at what happens to their judgments after they have a conversation, we see this huge effect where there's a striking alignment of their moral views, right? And this actually persists at time 3. And these are like probably the biggest effects I've ever seen in my research. And so, of course, I think this is pretty compelling that people have these conversations, and not only do they move a little bit, but they seem to be really aligning and building consensus with these people, with their conversation partners about these effects. So one question you might have is, well, what predicts moral alignment? And one thought we had was, well, maybe people's demographics are related to it, right? Like maybe if you are from the same political party, or you're the same sex, or you're the same race, or you're the same age, like maybe your orientation and priors about the world are such that you kind of experience the world in a similar way. So when you come in and you talk about these issues, you're coming in with a similar lens, and maybe that helps you kind of get on the same page and align in your views about this issue. And when we looked at that, we didn't see any evidence that shared demographics predicted moral alignment, right? This is not the case that simply by sharing a certain demographic with someone, are you necessarily going to align with them, right? And this is consistent with the idea that sharing a reality with someone goes above and beyond this kind of just observable demographic characteristics. Instead, what we looked at was we have this rich conversation data. We've video coded the data to look at what's going on in these conversations. And what we find are that shared reality behaviors, like if you are saying like, oh, I was just going to say that, or I feel that too, that's so true, where you're saying things nearly at the same time, or you're finishing each other's sentences and ideas, there's sort of signals of social connection and that you're building a shared reality with someone. And that seems to be very predictive of people actually privately aligning in their moral judgments after the conversation. Of course, one question you might have, and that at least I had, was like, well, I don't know, maybe people just had this really big alignment effect and they reached this consensus because of this mutual judgment, right? Maybe they had this conversation and then we asked people at the end, make this mutual judgment kind of publicly, and then afterward they made this private judgment. But like maybe people just were like, I don't know, I guess I said I would do that, and so I'll just do that. So we thought, maybe that's a problem. Maybe we should get rid of that. So in a second study, we removed the mutual judgment. We said, you know what? Look, we'll just have people make their own private judgments. They'll talk about things with the partner. They can just exchange ideas, and then they move on. And the other thing we wondered was how our effects might change over time. So we said, instead of having this be all part of the same trial, let's kick out those third judgments a week later. So you have this pre and post conversation judgments, and then a week later, we come back and we say, hey, look at these scenarios again and let us know what you think. Okay. And for sake of time, I'm just going to show you this graph here. Again, looking at the correlation of judgments over time. Yet again, at time 1, we see that people's judgments are sort of slightly positively correlated. And really compellingly, we see that, again, another striking alignment of moral views. And really cool is that we see that alignment hold up a full week later, right? So it seems like these short conversations with strangers about these kinds of ambiguous issues are shifting and changing people's judgments about them, and particularly in a way where they're aligning their views with their partner, and then they're carrying that forward into the world a whole week later and they still interpret that view and still have the same kind of judgment about that view a week later. So in summary, conversations shifted and aligned moral views. This occurred both with and without a mutual judgment. The effects held for a week. And I think this suggests that for everyday morally ambiguous events, conversations help people align their views, possibly as a way of creating a shared reality. Okay, I noticed that we are close on time. So what I'm going to do is shift to our last section here. But I think for sake of time, yeah, I'll do this. Is to sum up this more quickly. So in our last study here, in the previous studies I was just describing, there were sort of more ambiguous events, right? But you might ask, well, what about more like divisive issues, like big culture war issues, like political topics, climate change, gun rights, whatever, right? And so here we're looking at group conversations about climate change. And you might think that there's a lot of consensus on this, but actually like 57% of Americans, where is it? Here. Don't think 50% of Americans think global warming is human caused. So that's a substantive we don't even barely a majority who agrees on the causes of climate change. And the US is actually kind of an outlier here. people around the world underestimate how much consensus there is too. The thing to pay attention to here is that the red dots are actual consensus on climate change being human caused. The blue dots are how much people think, how much consensus people think. So people think there's like 60% consensus when actually there's 80% consensus. This is true across a number of different countries, and you can see how low the US is relative to some of these other outliers. And so what we did here is we said, look, it seems like we should get people to talk about climate change because people, by the way, don't really talk much about climate change. And so I don't think we have a good understanding of what happens when you talk about these divisive culture war issues and how does sort of the composition of the group affect your views. Okay. What I want to show here is that basically what we did is recruited a bunch of climate change believers and skeptics. We got their belief in climate change ahead of time. We had them join a group conversation that was either majority believers, majority skeptics, or an equal balance. So we were manipulating the composition of these conversations to who's in the group. And then afterward, we got a post measure of their belief in climate change, sort of a simplified version of what the experiment involved. There's not much more, but just a little simplified. And I think one key finding that keeps me up at night that I'm thinking about is what happened to these views? What happened to these climate change views when people talked? And what you see here is I'm plotting on the y-axis the change score in post minus pre belief, right? So larger positive values mean you increased your belief in climate change. Smaller negative values mean you decreased your belief in climate change. And on the x-axis, I'm plotting this dosage effect, which is essentially how many people in your group disagreed with you, right? Was it one person who disagreed with you, two people disagreed with you, three people disagreed with you? And what we see is that skeptics are stubborn and believers are bendable, right? So it didn't matter how many believers a skeptic was surrounded by, their view in climate change remained fairly skeptical. But when a believer was surrounded by skeptics, they really start to peel off here and start to doubt climate change, right? And actually, this measure of belief in climate change is a composite of 3 different items. And I'm showing that here. And what you can see is that drop-off is predominantly driven by believers doubting whether climate change is human caused, right? That the leftmost panel that you're looking at, right? So we have a number of different candidate mechanisms for maybe like why this asymmetry is happening, why these conversations are casting doubt in believers' minds. One, of course, is that it's just an individual difference account that maybe believers are liberals tend to be more open-minded, so maybe they're just kind of more receptive to new ideas. So maybe it's just chalked up to individual differences. Maybe it's a burden of proof asymmetry where climate change believers seem to have the burden of proof to prove that climate change is happening. Doesn't seem to be the case that climate skeptics have the burden of proof to prove that climate change is not happening. Of course, that's tricky because then if you're having to prove that something's true, especially like a big complex system like with global warming and climate change, it's easy to poke holes in that argument or cast doubt on it. And another is sort of skeptics as a minority in society, right? That they might be, it might be a really important identity for them and they're more resistant to change their views because that identity is very salient as a minority in society or a minority viewpoint in society. Or they might be more practiced, right? They might have swimming around people who disagree with them. They might have to make better arguments and be better practiced at making arguments about why we're not sure that climate change is necessarily human caused. Whereas believers probably swim in fish and water, right? Like you don't often have to run into people and try and convince them otherwise. So these are some mechanisms that we're currently collecting data for and testing now. But I just want to kind of sum this one up and say that social influence was asymmetric. A skeptic surrounded by believers remained skeptical, but a believer surrounded by skeptics began to doubt climate change. This is troubling, and I think it'd be really interesting to learn more about why those mechanisms, which mechanisms are most at play. We also, I didn't have time to show this, but surrounding a skeptic by a believer not only left them fairly skeptical, but it might even backfire, making them more likely to share their skeptical view with close friends. That's another aspect of the study design I have time to talk about. Okay. So in sum, I hope I've been able to share a little bit of my research that it's ongoing now too, around how people's moral and political views change through conversations and in social networks. And hopefully this starts to piece together a broader story of when people change their views, under what conditions they do, and how this might explain some of the broader societal shifts that we see that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk around important political issues over time. So with that, I just want to say thanks to my collaborators, to the labs at the various universities that I've been a part of for all of their support and assistance and feedback, to my research assistants who have been super helpful in a lot of this pretty intensive work, and to all of you for listening. So thanks. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's true. That effect is negative. I think that's probably some sort of compensatory effect that's happening when people talk to people from another race and are trying to be like extra like careful and polite and agreeable and kind of thing. I think that's probably what's going on there. I did look to see if part of that's driven by like people of the same race, maybe like they're so aligned that they can't become any more aligned. That's not the case. That's not true for these data. So I think it's probably some sort of like social compensatory effect that's going on there. But that effect was the only one that's a little bit negative and smaller. And yeah, but it's good. It's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's such a good question. We have thought about this. We, as part of our video coding, we looked at a number of things. We're actually still working on some of these models right now. But we did actually code people sharing personal experiences and facts. And those don't seem to be related to people's moral alignment, which I think is pretty interesting. I know there's some research that like sharing personal experiences helps like kind of humanize and things like that. It doesn't seem to be very necessarily persuasive in terms of people's attitude shifting here. Other things we looked at that I didn't discuss on for sake of time was like, obviously people come in with prior, like how certain they were at the outset or how moralized they had at the outset. Those are like stubbornness, rigidity factors. Like they were less likely to change if they came in and they were like, no, this is totally, I'm like so sure that this is the case, right? Things that you would expect bear out. But things like content of the conversation, we've been doing also some linguistic NLP analyses on the transcript data, trying to see if we can tease that apart. So yeah, so far nothing on the personal experiences and facts, which was a little surprising for me too. But stay tuned for more linguistic data to come. Arana and Ellie. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Everything's fine. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I 100% agree with that possible interpretation. I think that, yeah, it's probably something that weighs heavily on the minds of believers. And if you can say, oh, maybe it's not so bad after all, um, then that kind of rids you of some of the like self-blame that you have or some of your um, self-judgment of like, though I'm not doing enough to take action on solving it. So I think that could definitely be the case. I don't know if we're actually measuring like how much people feel responsible, culpable or responsible themselves personally, but I could see that being one potential candidate mechanism as well that could drive it. So yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Ali. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. I have looked at that. It was 9 trials in experiment 1 and 10 in experiment 2. Um, Interestingly, no. So they're still talking to the same person, but it seems like they're coming in fairly fresh to each scenario. Like they talk about something, they make sense of it, and then they look at the next scenario, and it's not like my time one rating is now more similar to my partner's. It's not like all of a sudden, I think because the scenarios differ quite a bit in the type of content it is, right? So if like all the scenarios were about, I don't know, like stealing or something, then you might be like, okay, I think we're starting to come to a shared sense of like what's cool and what's not for stealing. But because they range in topics, I think people were just kind of coming in each time fresh and being like, oh, like the New York City police officers, like they didn't pay for the turnstile, like that's not cool. And then all of a sudden you're talking about an ER doctor, a COVID, and it's kind of like it's varying enough. So I think that's maybe why we didn't see that. But yeah, it's a great question. It seemed like some dyads, it's also a lot of like, random intercept slope stuff of like some dyads do build rapport, some dyads don't. But I think on aggregate, these trend lines didn't really show up in terms of people's like time one judgments being sort of like more similar over time, over trials to their partner, which I share the same intuition. I thought, oh, like maybe that'd be the case, but yeah. Yeah. Yes.
It's like a extreme position while the leader might be more like moderate position, and since it's with the leaders, maybe like having someone who active be involved with like climate change practice and seeing it there, you'll still see that effect of the leadership.
Yeah. We haven't thought about bringing in like more extreme believers. Like let's bring in Al Gore. I think that I don't know if he's the best example to pick, but I think if you look at the degree here, this is at time one. So before they've had a group conversation, you can see that believers are believing in climate change more than skeptics, as you'd expect. But they're not like the skeptics aren't more at an extreme than the believers really. But I would imagine that if you brought in, again, this is all about right who is part of these conversations. If you brought in people that had more extreme views, I could see it actually going two ways. I could see it both being maybe more convincing, but also they could be more polarizing because they might come in incredibly dogmatic. And then people like just don't even, they're like shut off. They don't even want to listen to someone who's going to come in with such a dogmatic view. I think it'd be interesting to test that, but we haven't done that yet. So far, we've just sort of like pulled people together and just sort of like tagged them as either believers or skeptics. But yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Yes. Manipulation checks to be afterwards to figure out if people are identifying as in-group background. Because part of my thinking on that is, especially when we're thinking about some of the differences between sort of the politicians we showed, which were sort of a much broader group of politicians versus the way people responding that were mostly AOC Trump related, which are very sort of often the extremes, and people feel like, okay, I fall in the spectrum, but like that's not me.
Right.
The extent to which they're viewing them as part of their group,
yeah,
they are falling.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. I actually got asked this question a couple weeks ago as well. I haven't looked at this yet in the data, so I'm not sure is the short answer. But I could definitely see on some of those. I mean, there's literature to suggest right that like these parties are drifting and people are coming sort of like either more extreme or like all of a sudden not identifying as much as part of that political camp because they're like that's not. I didn't realize you shifted in that direction. So, but we do have a measure of political party identification, but we don't. The problem is we don't have it pre-post. We just have it at the outset of how much they identify with their party. So it'd be hard. I think it'd be hard for us to know with our data whether people's identification with their group decreased. But I definitely think that that's like that could be part of how much people disassociate from that political group is like definitely something that we could look into more. Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, guys.